edition of the Humanities Forum. I'm very pleased to see you all today on this. It feels like one of the first days of spring, right? But you're still thirsting for knowledge. We will not disappoint. So as you know, the forum my name is Ian Bernhoft. I coordinate the forum, which basically every Friday meets here in this room. And it gives you a chance to hear from scholars, from journalists, from professionals from around the world, around the country and around the world, who are sharing the questions that animate their research, and basically encouraging you to deepen your appreciation for the humanities. There's a couple of quick ground rules that I'll lay down before I pass this microphone off to people who have more interesting things to say than me. So one, our basic format is the talk will be about 50 minutes long, 45, 50 minutes, after which there's Q&A. And the rule in Q&A is the student has to ask the first question. So get those wheels turning now as to what you want to know more about so that you can raise your hand. And when that moment comes, I'll bring the mic to you, say your name, say your question. I'll be off from there. We'll wrap up right at 4:45, at which point there's a reception down the hall in the great room, some really nice appetizers, et cetera. So it's a good way to start your weekend. You can talk about what you heard and what you're going to do next. Okay, and then so go to the reception. That's a rule. Ask a question. That's a rule. Not all of you have to ask a question. The other rule is please shut down those laptops, put those phones away. Spend a little while being present in the room you're actually in. You'll be better off for it. And if, in case you miss anything, we'll post the recording next week. You can play it back in a 0.75 speed. It'll be good. All right, with that, I'm going to pass the microphone over to my colleague, Dr. Patrick Breen, who's going to introduce our guest.
Thank you, Ian. It's my pleasure to present today Michael Vorenberg. Michael Vorenberg is a repeat visitor to the Humanities Forum. His last visit was, I know you never answered the question, not quite 10 years ago, we think, but I think before COVID. So it was a while back. And we had him talking about his last book, which was Final Freedom. Now, not every book, not every academic's book you know, and I would expect that with the exception of possibly Mario, no one in this room has read that book, because I haven't assigned it in a class recently. But it's a book you know indirectly. Final Freedom was the one that Tony Kushner used at his right hand when he was making the screenplay for Lincoln, a movie I bet many people in the room have seen. How many of you have seen Lincoln? So a bunch of you have seen the movie that's deeply connected to his last book. Well, today we're not going to be talking about the rise of the 13th Amendment and the history of that. We're going to be talking about something else, which is covered in his new book, Lincoln's Peace. And by new book, I mean new book. This book was published by Knopf on March 18th. I happen to know that because I had a class read it between then and now, so we really had to make sure the publisher had it. But they got it, and several of my students here have it in their hands, and so that's great. This book is an interesting and important book about how we think about dating and the starting and end points of the Civil War. He's thinking about the questions ending. The question animating this book is, when did the Civil War end? And once you ask the question, it's one of those questions you don't think to ask, unless you're looking up on Wikipedia. I mean, what's the date on Wikipedia, by the way? I never use that.
It's a series of dates.
It's a series of dates. Okay. So once you ask the question, you go to Wikipedia and there's a series of dates. And you're like, hold on, this is confusing. I want to know when it ended. Well, Michael Vorenberg is going to explain that to us now. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to take your... How about you, Jack? Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Ian, very much for the introduction and all the credit. Thank you to the Humanities Forum and Providence College as well. This, the most beautiful day we've had in many, many days, that you should be inside listening to me doesn't seem quite fair, but I appreciate that. For those of you in Professor Breen's class who were assigned his book and have read it, I'll answer your question now that yes, Amazon does have a good returns policy, and you can look that up. So, no, seriously, I thank you all for those who've read it already. For those who don't know the book and haven't read it, what I'm going to do today is basically run through certain parts of the book without summarizing the whole thing, don't worry. And then, but what I'm trying to do here is do more than just raise issues of what is in the book, but to raise bigger questions that relate not only to the Civil War, but to today, to wars in general, and how we think about the time and place of war. These are questions that are almost always with us. They are with us right now in ways that I may touch on later on today. And of course, during the Civil War, that's an obvious issue. It is, after all, a civil war. The story of this book and how it came to be has its own narrative, which I'll start with by saying that I didn't know I was going to write a book about how the Civil War ended, or when the Civil War ended. It came to me sort of by accident when I was doing research on another book, and a box was delivered to me at the National Archives, and it was the wrong box. But while waiting for the right box, went ahead and looked at it, and I found that someone had taken all these notes and written a report back in around 1890. For various reasons, they were trying to figure out the legal end date of the American Civil War. And this was someone who worked for the War Department. And when I saw the name of the file, which in big letters said "End of the Civil War," I said, well, that's kind of stupid. Why would you do a whole big thing on that? Because everyone knows that the war ended on April 9, 1865. And I'll say that date again because you're going to hear me say it a lot. April 9, 1865. On that date, the Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses Grant. And that moment of surrender was something emblazoned in my mind, just because there's images of it in many textbooks, in many other ways in popular culture. Patrick Breen mentioned the 2012 film Lincoln by Steven Spielberg. There's a scene in that film towards the end where Lee and Grant are there at Appomattox, sort of acknowledging each other. So even in a blockbuster film, you have a scene of Appomattox. So why in the world would anyone be researching the end of the war? We know the end of the war. And the person who was doing the research, someone named Lewis Grant, who was an assistant secretary of war, no relation to Ulysses Grant, he'd actually been at Appomattox that day as an officer for the US Army. So he had seen the end. But there was this legal problem he was trying to solve, because you actually have to have legal start and end dates for a war for various reasons, which may come up later. And he discovered that the legal end date was not Appomattox, was not the surrender of Lee. And then he had opened up the whole question of, well, if it wasn't then, when was it? And so that then had me going down the same rabbit hole that Lewis Grant did, as I tried to figure this question out too. The cover of the book that you see here is a painting done in 1868, 3 years after Appomattox, by a painter named George Healy. And it depicts an actual meeting that took place in Virginia on March 28th, 1865, so about 10 days before that Appomattox surrender. And I'll come back to this meeting briefly in a brief bit. The meeting is obviously Lincoln, you'll recognize. You may even recognize the man to Lincoln's right. That's Ulysses Grant. And that is the foot of William Tecumseh Sherman. And so he's meeting with Grant and Sherman, and then off screen, if you will, is the Admiral David Dixon Porter. So these are the top generals of the Union Army under Lincoln. Grant, the biggest general, well, he's the top general, and then Sherman, being the general of the West, as it was called, and then Dixon, the general, if you will, the Admiral of the Oceans. And he's meeting them because they know, he knows, Lincoln knows, that very soon there could be surrenders of the Confederate Army. And he needs to talk to his top brass about what to do when surrender comes. What terms to negotiate with those who surrender. And so there's a meeting held on March 28th there. And first I want to set the scene a little bit more because, as I said, Lincoln is in Virginia. He's at Grant's headquarters. This is unusual. It's unusual for a president during this period to leave the White House. This meeting was part of Lincoln's trip that was the longest trip by far that he would ever leave the White House. He had left on a couple other occasions. He went and visited Grant at headquarters, but usually only for a night. He went to Pennsylvania to deliver an address at a town called Gettysburg. But again, these were short trips. When he leaves Washington, D.C. a couple days before the meeting depicted here, he leaves with the intention not to come back until he has seen the end of the Civil War and until, I argue, he's basically orchestrated what the end will look like, what the peace will look like after the war. That's therefore why you get the title Lincoln's Peace. He believes that he's going to witness and help orchestrate that end. And certainly on this day of March 28th, painted where the painter has depicted the scene, that is his belief. A little bit of geography for us. If you look at the top of the map, you'll see Washington, D.C. And so you follow the blue arrows, and this is how he's getting to the headquarters. He's going to come up the James River to City Point, which is here. City Point is the headquarters of Grant. And he'll arrive there on March 27th. And if you can see this, the Appomattox River flows downward and meets the James here. That river will become important in this story. But also notice City Point. Now go due north of City Point, right? And you come to Richmond, capital of the Confederacy and the capital of Virginia. Again, if you don't know anything about the Civil War, that's fine. Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, Washington, D.C., the capital of the Union, strikingly close, right? That here he is, here's Lincoln, not very far from the capital of the Confederacy, and the war is absolutely going on when he comes into City Point. City Point, the headquarters of Grant's army, is a bustling community. You get a sense of that. Lots of tents. There are railroads coming in and out of this community, and of course ships. Lincoln has taken a paddle wheel boat, side wheeler down, and this boat, it's not exactly the one you see there, but it looks like it, called the River Queen. This is where Lincoln sleeps. This is where he meets with people, and it's docked on the wharf at City Point. This is effectively his office, if you will, where he's going to meet with a lot of people during his time in Virginia, which will last 2 weeks. Now I come to that meeting on March 28th. And now you see the full cast of characters I mentioned. There are two things from this meeting that I'll just bring up that we know about that are relevant here. One is that Lincoln is quite shocked to see Sherman present. Why? So Sherman is to visit Grant, but he's not supposed to be in Virginia. Sherman is supposed to be in the interior of North Carolina. Why? Because Sherman commands an army that's bigger than the army that Grant commands in Virginia, that's currently in North Carolina. Why? Because there's a Confederate army in North Carolina under a general named Joe Johnston, and that Confederate army is bigger than the army commanded by Robert E. Lee in Virginia. When Lincoln sees Sherman, he's shocked and says, "What are you doing here?" You know, he's worried, like, who's in charge of the army back in North Carolina? With assurances from Grant and Sherman, Lincoln says, okay, it's all right. There's no fighting going on in North Carolina. I bring that up because it's important for us to remember, again, we're so focused on Virginia and Appomattox, which is in Virginia, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, that it's easy to forget that at this moment, across the South, there are Confederate troops. There's a big army in North Carolina. West of the Mississippi, there are 50,000 Confederate soldiers. And I haven't even begun to touch on the fact that there are still Confederates operating gunboats on rivers. There's a Confederate ship that's operational on the oceans. So there's a lot of troops spread out over a vast space here when this conversation is going on. The second thing to mention is, what is it that Lincoln says in terms of what are the terms of the surrender? And what Lincoln says, the phrase that he uses when he says to his commanders what attitude to take to the surrendering Confederates when that time comes, is let them up easy. Let them up easy. What Lincoln is doing in that phrase is he's referring to a wrestling metaphor. And it comes from his own personal time as a young man on the Illinois frontier, where he was a fairly young man and new to the society and was trying to get in good with the community. And he did this through giving a lot of talks, oratory, convincing people he was a great speaker, which he was, but also through wrestling. There was a group of guys, the Cleary boys, as they were known, and so he would challenge them to wrestling matches, and he would win. But it wasn't the winning that mattered. What mattered was that when he had the guy down who he had beaten, and it was clear that Lincoln had the upper hand, right? Then you stand up, you let the other guy up, you let him up easy. You don't smack him, you don't taunt, you don't rub it in his face. You let him up easy. The person who stands up, you shake hands, and now honor has been created between the defeated and the victor. And in so doing, not only have you showed yourself a proficient fighter and wrestler, but you've now created a bond with the defeated that will serve you well going forward, which is exactly what happens on the frontier in this town of New Salem in Illinois. And this is what Lincoln has in mind when he uses this metaphor from wrestling, let him up easy. This is the theme that Lincoln has been stressing for some time, the theme of mercy and kindness to those who are defeated. Earlier in March, Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address, and in that address comes the last line, the most famous line of that inaugural address, with malice toward none, with malice toward none. This idea that the war will come to an end at some point, and when that happens, it's really important that, he expected the North to win, of course, that the North not show malice toward the defeated, to be kind, to be benevolent, because he understood that Reconstruction lay ahead. This is a message that I'll come back to, this idea of let him up easy, said in this moment. Obviously, a painter can't capture dialogue. I mean, they could have put little thought bubbles or speaking bubbles, but no. So the way the painter captures this message is if you look over Lincoln's left shoulder in the window, there's a rainbow. And the idea of the rainbow is that there's a piece coming, right? They're talking and pieces in the offing. It's nearby. And so this was the notion. Now, the painter, of course, knows what's coming. That is, within 10 days, there's going to be this great surrender. So now, if you go back up the Appomattox River, what happens is that meeting happens on March 28th. A few days later, the capital of the Confederacy falls, Richmond. Petersburg, the railroad hub of Virginia, and really the Confederacy falls at the same day. They are now occupied, these cities, by US troops. On April 4th, 1865, 160 years ago today, Lincoln travels to the Confederate capital, Richmond, and he visits the capital. Jefferson Davis, who has been inhabiting the capital, is not there. He left the capital the day before. He escaped with his whole cabinet on a rail car. The rail car headed towards the interior of Virginia to get away, worried that they would be captured. And Davis is now running the Confederacy from a railroad car. And I'm not making this up. He calls it the cabinet car. In the railroad, in another car, there's some gold and silver. This is the Confederate treasury. And Davis gives speeches along the way saying that the Confederacy is most certainly not dead. It is alive, and it's never been stronger. And we can say, how can this possibly be? And his argument is that the armies that had been defending Richmond and Petersburg no longer have to defend Petersburg and Richmond. They're free now to join with other armies and to wage war against the Union Army. So that's why Davis is not in Richmond when Lincoln goes to Richmond on the 4th. On April 9th, then, we get the most memorable moment. I think so many of us have seen versions of this, or maybe even this particular version. It certainly is fixed in my head, this idea of Lee surrendering to Grant at this moment at Appomattox. The town is called Appomattox Courthouse at the time, even though it's not a courthouse. This is a private home of Wilmer McLean. It's the parlor where Lee surrenders to Grant. And you see all the people around them on April 9th. Most of them are Grant's attendees. Lee also had a couple of people with him watching the surrender and dictating terms, or getting the terms down in paper, I should say, to be signed. And the terms, which I won't go into too much detail here, but you may have questions about them, are lenient. This is now back to the theme of let them up easy. They are lenient. The idea was Lincoln could have arrested all of Lee's men and put them in prison. He could have tried all of the men, or certainly the officers, for treason. There were members of Lincoln's administration who did want to try the high officers, and certainly Jefferson Davis, whenever he got captured for treason, maybe even execute them. But Lincoln didn't do this. The terms of the surrender were such that, yes, everyone had to stack their army-issued rifles, all the Confederates did, but then they got to go home. They're given what are called paroles. Paroles are slips of paper that give them safe passage home, and they're not to be arrested or bothered, and they can go home because, as Grant said to Lee, we want the men to go back and help plant their crops because it was time to plant crops. They also got to keep, the officers and those who had them, sidearms, that is pistols, even though they had to stack their army-issued rifles. That's interesting, too, for those of you who are interested in the history of firearms and firearms law, that they let these men who had just recently been at war with them go home armed, the officers at least. So those are some of the surrender terms, but there are others. And so this date, April 9, 1865, becomes, in our minds, the end date, even if we don't know the actual date of the war. And again, I'm fine using it as the end date of the war. I teach the Civil War class at Brown University, and I've taught it for many years, and I can't help myself from using phrases like, after Appomattox, which is a way of saying after the Civil War, or this is a post-Appomattox event, meaning after Appomattox. And yet, even at this moment, the principals involved understood very well that this wasn't a simple, single moment where on one side there is war and on the other side there is peace. That this would take a process to bring the war out of a state of war and into a state of peace. The day after this very famous meeting between Lee and Grant, the two generals will meet again in a meeting that almost never is discussed or spoken of. Grant, in the morning of April 10th, will ride out to meet with Lee between the lines under a flag of truce. The two men will meet sitting on horseback, and they will talk to one another, and no one is within earshot. So unlike the day before, we don't have hard proof as to what is said. Grant, years later, would write his memoirs, and he would explain what was said. And that is, I think, a trustworthy source. Grant rode out, and Lee rode out, and then Grant asked Lee if he would contact Davis, wherever Davis was, he's on the run, and ask Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, to surrender. Because you needed the president of the Confederacy to surrender for the whole Confederacy to surrender. And this would then put a true end to the war, because at that point, all armed Confederates should follow the president and surrender. And Robert E. Lee heard this request and said no. He would not do this. He refused to write such a message to his superior, Jefferson Davis. He said that as his inferior officer, he would not overstep his bounds and take on this kind of duty. Now, the other thing is that Robert E. Lee knew that Jefferson Davis would never surrender, and he wouldn't. Jefferson Davis was captured on May 10th, but he never surrendered. Even after being imprisoned in Virginia, he never surrendered. And that was something he was very proud of, and other Confederates after the war are very proud of. So Lee says no, and then there's a pause, awkward pause, and then Lee says to Grant, you know, I wonder if it may take you and your army 3 or 4 times marching back and forth across the continent before you've really put this rebellion completely down. That's a statement of how much insurgency lies ahead, potentially, how much war lies ahead, and how long Grant's army is really going to have to work. And Grant, in response, doesn't say no. He simply says, I just hope that it's not without too much bloodshed. That's a better predictor of what is to come than what happened the day before, because war continues for some time, and a state of war, a legal state of war, continues even beyond that. When, then, does the Civil War end? So let me jump now to the end point and give you a different ending, a different answer and ending, which is the legal end. And I'll keep on coming back to that theme of legal, that wars actually have legal endpoints in addition to what we might think of as a political endpoint or a cultural point, or most likely a military endpoint. The military endpoint being when you say, well, one side is clearly won militarily. The legal endpoint of the Civil War comes 16 months after the surrender of Appomattox. On August 20th, 1866, on August 20th, 1866, the president at that time, Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor after Lincoln's assassinated, will issue a proclamation saying that the insurrection is at an end. Johnson does this effectively to announce that a state of war no longer exists in the United States. And this is very important because it's Johnson's way to signal that because war is over, he's now going to pull the remaining US troops that are in the South out of the South. And so now the country will move ahead without armed forces in the South. That's going to be really important for Reconstruction, because if that happens, then the process of Reconstruction going forward is going to be greatly hindered if there's no application of US force in the form of the US Army to make it happen. That's what Johnson is up to when he issues this proclamation 16 months after the war. So I was surprised to discover, not the proclamation, which I knew something about, but I was surprised to discover some years back that this is actually the official legal end date, which is to say it gets affirmed by the US Supreme Court within a year of this proclamation. The US Supreme Court affirms that this is indeed the legal end point of the war. And yet it's so easily missed, right? And so if we think about a timeline then, we really have a 16-month end of the war, although I would argue that it keeps on going beyond August. That's a typo. It says August 2nd. It should say August 20th. We have a big timeline here, which begins at Appomattox, if you will, and ends 16 months later. How then do we say that the war ends? When does a war end? So if we just step back and ask that question that way, when does a war end? Well, one answer would be, right, the last battle. Okay, that's good. So let's go find the last battle of the American Civil War. Right away, we've got a problem. There are 2 different sites in the United States that claim to be the site of the last battle of the Civil War. And they come a month apart. You probably can't see that, but don't worry. One is in April 16th, so that's a week after Appomattox, in western Georgia, in the town of Columbus, Georgia, Battle of Columbus. I'm not going to talk about these battles unless you want me to later. The other one comes a month later at Palmito Ranch, which is in southern Texas, right on the border of Mexico, on the Rio Grande, a set of skirmishes over 2 days. Separated by a month, both claim to be the last battle. Go to either site. I'm just going to show you them. So Columbus is there. Here's Palmito Ranch. Go to either site today, and you'll find a plaque announcing the last battle of the Civil War, this despite the fact that they are 1,000 miles apart. Now, the people of Columbus, you see, wrote the last important land battle. So that was their way of saying, yeah, we came a month before, but we're the important last battle. Palmito Ranch, not such a battle. Palmito Ranch, there was fighting, there were casualties, somebody died. And in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, which in itself is a massive project that was created in the 1890s, the people who created that 100-volume set wrote after the Battle of Palmito Ranch, this was the last battle. So who knows? But this is the kind of thing I kept on running into over and over again. You ask us what seems like a simple question, what is the last battle? And you run into problems. And I take us through this in the book, which is why a lot of people are going to be frustrated in reading this book, because I want you to share my frustration and suffering as I went looking for the end and kept on running into these roadblocks. All right, forget battles. What about the last surrender? The last enemy to surrender seems like a reasonable way to think of an end of the war. Good. So Lee was not the last to surrender. Joe Johnston is in North Carolina, as I mentioned. He surrenders at the end of April. That's good. That's the last big army. But no, because I said there are 50,000 men west of the Mississippi. They're under the command of a Confederate general named Edmund Kirby Smith. Kirby Smith arranges a surrender to take place on June 2nd, 1865. It's going to happen on a boat in the port off of Galveston, Texas. But Kirby Smith doesn't show up because he's worried he's going to be arrested and hanged. So he leaves and heads for Mexico, joining with another Confederate general named Joe Shelby with his own men. Those guys are going to cross into Mexico with plans to make an alliance with Mexican troops there. They're actually not Mexican troops, they're French under Napoleon. Long story there, but that's in the book too, because they expect to create a new army, come storming back over the Rio Grande and keep the war alive. So that doesn't work as a surrender. The last Confederate general to surrender, that happens, now we're into June 16th, and I'll skip the timeline here and go right to here. The last Confederate general to surrender is Stand Watie, or Watie as some pronounce it. So Watie is surrendering in what is today Oklahoma, then was called Indian Territory. This is a territory in Oklahoma today where there are the so-called civilized tribes. These are tribes that each had sovereignty. They were sovereign tribes. As sovereign tribes, they could join legally with either side in the rebellion. And all of them, all but one, join with the Confederate side. And that includes the Cherokee tribe, the Cherokee. And Stand Watie is a Cherokee chief. The Cherokee have actually split long before the Civil War. The Cherokee actually are factionalized. And Stand Watie has claimed himself to be the only chief of the Cherokee, although actually there's another Cherokee chief named John Ross who is acknowledged by the US to be the only chief. Anyway, here's Stand Watie. He's a Cherokee chief, but he's also a Confederate general. And he has his own army that's fighting for the Confederacy and has been fighting for years for the Confederacy. And on June 23rd, he surrenders in Dokesville, in Indian Territory, so-called. And that surrender is depicted by a modern artist. This painting hangs in the Oklahoma State Capitol. And the artist, Dennis Parker, was kind enough to let me use this painting, reprint it in my book, and then to tell me things I didn't know about the surrender that are pretty interesting. The surrender takes place not in Cherokee territory, but Creek territory. There's other details like that. Part of the fun of writing this book was learning as I went, certain things from people I didn't even know I would be learning from, like someone who decided he was going to do this painting and therefore did his own research about this and then was willing to share what he had learned with me. So this is how I sort of come to know things, through standard methods, but also talking to people who've done this kind of work. Except this is not the last surrender. Again, why isn't it? In 1864, a year before the war is over, the Confederacy launched a really clever mission. It effectively bought a huge ship called the Shenandoah from the English, from an English private citizen. And it turned the ship into a warship. And it put on the ship Confederate naval officers. And their mission was the following: to sail from England, where they bought the ship. They were to sail east around Africa to Australia, to dock in Australia and resupply, and then sail to the North Pacific and be there for the spring-summer of 1865. Why? Because the Northern Pacific are the hunting grounds for whales at that time. And this is where the New England whaling fleet operates, and this is where the richest source of whale oil is at the time. The idea of war is not just to destroy armies, but to destroy economic resources. And the Shenandoah's task was to set fire to the whaling fleet or sink them, and in so doing, to do as much economic destruction as it could to the New England whaling fleet. And so, it is for this reason that in midsummer 1865, months after the surrender at Appomattox, the Shenandoah comes upon the New England whaling fleet, destroys basically all of it, and in so doing, in 1 week, does more economic destruction in 1 week to the Union side than is done in any other week of the Civil War. This, after the war, is supposedly over. It is a story that is similar to other times that we think about war, where sometimes some force in an army doesn't get the memo and doesn't get the knowledge that the war is over. How could they possibly know, sailing in the Northern Pacific, that Richmond has fallen, that Lee has surrendered? After the destruction, they begin to run into other ships that say, Richmond has fallen, Lee has surrendered, and they refuse to believe it. Lee would never surrender. No way Richmond could fall. And so they keep on sailing south. As they approach San Francisco, they get their guns ready. They want to shell San Francisco on the way out of the Pacific, just for the hell of it. And then they run into a ship that has newspapers with headlines that say, Lee has surrendered and Richmond has fallen. And they realize, oh no, because these newspapers and those headlines are dated back in April, and they caused their destruction in June and July, which means they were doing all this destruction when the war was over, which means they are pirates. They are unauthorized. As pirates, they can be hanged by any country. That's the law of nations. And so there is a great discussion on board of where are we going to go now? Because wherever we go, we could be hanged. And so they end up sailing all the way around South America, back across the Atlantic, and surrendering. Let me get this back right. Surrendering in the River Mersey, Liverpool, England, November 6th, 1865. Last surrender. In England, by a Confederate ship that most of us have never heard of. Is that the last surrender? Yeah, I'd say yes. I'll just point out that they could have been hanged. They weren't. There were officials of the US government there who said, we want them. We want all those sailors back in the US. We want to try them, and we want to hang them. But there was a diplomatic arrangement made with the British that this would not happen, because actually many of the people on board were British. And so that didn't happen. These people, if you will, were let up easy in a Lincoln kind of way. They were not hanged. Now my timeline has gotten so packed It's unreadable, and that's fine. But the point is to show you that when you go looking for the end of the war, you find not one, but a series of incidents. In his kind introduction, Patrick Breen asked about, well, when does Wikipedia say? So that actually is something I did early on. I went onto Wikipedia and say, conclusion of the Civil War, and not one, but many dates show up. And if Wikipedia can't come up with a simple answer, then probably it's not a simple answer. And yet for all that searching, and for all those different dates, and all those interesting stories, I really haven't even told the half of it. Why? The Civil War, by 1865, from the northern perspective, from the perspective of the federal government, from the perspective of the Union soldiers, and most certainly from the perspective of the black soldiers fighting from the Union and for the enslaved more than 4 million people in the South, was a war about the destruction of slavery. The war maybe did not begin that way. There were all sorts of protestations at the start of the war from the North that this was a war to preserve the Union, to reconstruct the Union, and not a war to destroy slavery. But this argument simply could not gain traction in 1865 because the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed in 1863. In January of 1865, the 13th Amendment had passed through Congress and was being ratified by the states. Lincoln had supported it. In the second inaugural that Lincoln gives in March, the one that says, with malice toward none, the paragraph before that, Lincoln says that the war is about slavery. He says it explicitly, and that the war must go on. The war must go on until slavery is destroyed, until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be drawn with the sword. Such shall be the judgment of God. If the end of a war, any war, is about the attainment of the objective of the victor, then the end of the Civil War must be the attainment of emancipation, the end of racialized slavery in the United States under this logic. And yet, nothing I've said so far, and last battle, last surrender, the stuff that Lincoln is on the ship talking to his guys about, you'll notice I never mentioned slavery. I never mentioned emancipation. And that's not me being tricky. It's the fact that you can study all this stuff and easily miss slavery. You can miss the fact that when Lee surrenders to Grant in the parlor of the McLean house at Appomattox, they are surrounded by Union troops, including regiments of black soldiers, who absolutely believe this surrender means emancipation. And yet, slavery and emancipation is not discussed in the room, where it happened, if you will, of Lee and Grant. Lee's army consists of hundreds of impressed black people, men and women, who are enslaved. They were impressed by private slave owners to work as laborers for the Confederate Army. Furthermore, Confederate officers have servants, so-called, with them. These are enslaved people that have gone to war with them. There are hundreds of enslaved black people surrounding that meeting in Appomattox. Those people end up going home, many of them. Some actually break free and end up in Richmond. It was very hard for me to track them, and I didn't get to track many of them. But of course, the whole point is they're not in the picture. They're not in the scene, and they weren't part of the discussion. Where exactly is emancipation in all of this story? And if we create below our timeline other sorts of stories beyond the military and the legal, right? What else do you get? Now, I'm leaving out a whole bunch of stuff here, which is faded and in orange, which is a big part of the book, which has to do with Native Americans. I mentioned Stand Watie, or Watie, of the Cherokee, but he's just one Native American. There are many tribes, not only in Oklahoma, but on the Great Plains and in the Southwest, where fighting continues between US troops and Native peoples well beyond Appomattox. That's in the book, but I'm just going to leave that be for the moment, and focus on what's in purple, which is emancipation, which is also a timeline here, right? So if we think about the key dates of emancipation, May 1, that's an important date because it will become Memorial Day, but that's a longer story. African Americans in South Carolina, in Charleston, will actually decorate the graves there of many people, and that will evolve into Memorial Day, but that's an important black holiday. But even more important and better known to us is Juneteenth. June 19, 1865. This is now, as of a few years ago, a federal holiday. And on June 19, 1865, Union soldiers occupy Galveston, Texas, and the commander of the Union force that occupies Galveston stands in Galveston, reads the Emancipation Proclamation, as well as a proclamation that he has written that declares black and white in a state of absolute equality. Absolute equality is the phrase. Unfortunately, in Texas, that yearning or the desire or proclamation for absolute equality does not come to fruition very fast at all. Nonetheless, black people of Texas never forget that phrase, absolute equality. And a year afterwards, on June 19, 1866, they gather in Houston, in Galveston, in Dallas, in all the big cities of Texas, and they have parades and celebrations to remind the Union Army of the promise of absolute equality. So that's Juneteenth, and I can say more about that if you have questions. It takes a long time before what is a Texas local holiday becomes national, and then federal, that is an approved official holiday. But I haven't mentioned the 13th Amendment, which is not ratified until December of 1865, and then becomes part of the Constitution. I could go on with the major acts of Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the 14th Amendment, 1868, the 15th Amendment granting black men the vote, 1870. All of these things are crucial dates in a timeline that we usually think of as a timeline that runs from black slavery to black freedom, or if you will, Reconstruction. We don't put that in the same timeline as the Civil War. They're separated out. And yet, how could we do that? How can we possibly do that? Again, if the wartime objective is black freedom, then of course black freedom must be part of the timeline of the end of the Civil War. What does it mean that a country honors as the end of the Civil War a moment or moments where slavery and emancipation is left out? I'll just put that question out there and let us think about what it means. When you enter Appomattox County today, every entrance to the county has this exact sign. Where our nation reunited, a message of unity, coming together, Lee, Grant, honorable men, signing surrender. Notice arms that are stacked, an end of violence, a true peace. But we know better. Certainly you should know better now after hearing me say all these things, that this was not a moment of perfect reuniting. I'm not even sure that full reuniting has occurred. And I certainly know that the arms were not stacked at Appomattox. The shooting continued. Go down to Galveston, the site that would become the important site of Juneteenth. And a mural was started there a few years back by an artist named Reginald Adams and a team of artists. And it's called Absolute Equality because of that phrase that shows up in that proclamation from June 19, 1865. And this is the end of the war as painted, if you will, by a team of artists. You'll see the black soldiers up there and here, those black men looking over the white man, that's General Granger, who's signing the order that says absolute equality. This gets kind of fun. Reginald Adams, I'm very grateful to him that he let me use this image in my book. So Adams and the other four major artists who did the mural, they put themselves in the painting. That's them in Union uniform right there. It's also cool about a mural is that you can paint over it. So this is the painting as it was a couple of years ago. That's Harriet Tubman on the left. She's still there. Lincoln's there. Granger and the troops are still there. This stuff is gone. That's a black astronaut. There's new stuff there. This is how memorials work in other countries, an understanding that memory shifts over time. The meaning of an event changes over time. And as it changes, you might want to actually change the thing that honors that moment. It is not the way Americans tend to work, where we tend to look for simplicity and fixity in our history and our memory. Another reason why I prefer this particular image to this one. How will the end of the Civil War be remembered 160 years from today, as we think about it 160 years later? I do not know. But I do hope that maybe these signs on Appomattox County's borders will be revised, maybe, changed a bit, and have an element about them that perhaps is drawn from or looks a little bit more like this. But I don't know. That's a future that I can't foresee. I'm just about the past, I guess. But I hope that you'll all think about that, and maybe someday you too will get involved in the process of memorializing the end of the American Civil War. Thank you for today.
So remember, when the microphone gets to you, name and question.
My name is Aiden Nolan, and the question I wanted to ask, and it's somewhat speculative, but I just wanted to ask, in your opinion, if Lincoln were to have not been assassinated and he was to handle the process of Reconstruction rather than Andrew Johnson, do you think that, or rather how do you think that would have played out differently? Obviously, given that we know Andrew Johnson's actions did not really help the process of Reconstruction.
So, thank you for the question. And the question is, how might things have looked different had Lincoln not been assassinated? He was shot on April 14th and died on April 15th. This is one of the most asked questions. And even if it's not asked, it hangs over everything, doesn't it? So if you haven't seen the Spielberg movie, and even if you have and don't remember it, it hangs over the film because we see Lincoln marching off to the theater, and then, of course, he's assassinated. But you don't see the assassination. But a big part of the movie is Lincoln dealing with radical Republicans. These are people who want immediate equal rights for black Americans, people like Thaddeus Stevens, who's a big part in the film, played by Tommy Lee Jones. So hanging over the film is a notion that when Lincoln dies, the radicals now are going to have this great power, and the moderate voice, Lincoln, won't be around to somehow moderate extremism. That notion of Reconstruction is very old, and it's actually a problematic way of thinking about Reconstruction. So I'll just point that out first. I have a real problem with that particular way of thinking about things. Had Lincoln lived, he would have added moderation to the radicals. But I think more important, he worked better politically with all parties, radical, conservative, the opposing party, which was the Democratic Party at the time. When Andrew Johnson comes into office as vice president, he's actually welcomed, as people think he's going to be a great president. The radicals are very happy to have Andrew Johnson because Johnson has been speaking a line that the South should be punished, former Confederates should be punished. This is not a line of let them up easy. This is a serious line of punishment. It turns out that within a few months, Johnson has completely switched and forms alliances with the leading former Confederates. He'll turn completely against African American rights. He'll veto all the key measures for black equality, and then those vetoes will be overridden in Congress by the radical Republicans. So how would Lincoln have handled all this differently is the great question. And Lincoln, I don't know, except he would have been much better than Andrew Johnson, much better at Johnson in dealing with Congress. But saying that a president is better than Andrew Johnson is setting the bar too low. This is not a good president, and one of our worst. When historians are asked to rank presidents, Johnson's usually at the bottom or close to. So that's good, but I think he would have done a great job. I think he would have pushed in a way that would have been more moderate, and a lot of the things that needed to happen in terms of legal rights for African Americans would have happened without all the political fuss and struggle. I really do believe that. Except, I do think, and here's where I will probably come in for criticism in the book, Lincoln was not perfect. When he died, and I think this might have changed had he lived, but when he died, it was Lincoln's belief, as it had been from the beginning of the war, that if you think about all Southern whites involved in the Confederate enterprise, fighting for the Confederacy, the way Lincoln thought about them was as an upper crust of Confederate leaders, slave owners, super wealthy, radical secessionists, who had dragged along with them the mass of ordinary white people. What Lincoln said at that meeting on board the River Queen, it's on the cover of my book, is that we must separate out the deluded ordinary white men of the South from the leaders. In other words, he believed that the ordinary white men were duped, that all they needed was to realize that they had been duped. Scales would come from their eyes, and they would then join happily with the Union cause. Here, I think Lincoln was naive. I don't think he realized how deeply embedded in ordinary Southern whites' hearts and minds was the idea of a Confederate nation, of a white supremacist society, of an anti-national government ideology, all these things that would show themselves to be completely tenacious during the period of 1865, 66, 67 going forward during Reconstruction, and maybe even in some ways today. Had Lincoln lived, a point would have come when he would have had to confront something he never had to confront in his lifetime, that his faith in the ordinary white people and in their loyalty to the Union was misplaced, perhaps, and that the people who were the much obvious and better bet to be loyal to the Union were black people. And that being the case, what you do in terms of running a government is that you empower black people with political rights and you disempower your enemies. Lincoln hadn't come to that point where he had to confront that reality of that's the best way forward. When that point came, what would he have done? I don't know. But we know it now, and a lot of people knew it then, that black people in the South were much more trustworthy than whites to be truly loyal to the Union cause. Lincoln hadn't yet gotten there by the time of his death.
Next question.
Hi there, Andrew Horn. Would you just say some more about the issues in the Supreme Court case that you mentioned about Johnson's declaration?
Yeah, it's not a big court case. It's a minor case. So there's all this stuff that happens that are, I'm going to say, relatively trivial, but have to be resolved around end of war, okay? So what do I mean? In the case that leads the Lewis Grant thing to go forward, it's a pension application, and a guy's looking for a war pension. And so the problem is he joined up in early 1866, and everyone says, you don't get a war pension, the war was over. He says, no, it wasn't, the war was going on. So all this has to be resolved, right? Here's another thing. Somebody's property is confiscated, and it's confiscated by the Union government, and it's confiscated because the person in question is regarded to be disloyal. And so his land is his property is confiscated. Absolutely something that you can do in wartime, and Congress had passed laws allowing for confiscation. But if the war was over, then confiscation shouldn't be happening anymore. Now we have our case. Someone whose property is confiscated says, you shouldn't have confiscated my property in this point because the war was over. Government says, yeah, we can. The war wasn't over. Now it's going to make its way through the courts, and now finally the Supreme Court has to decide, when did the war actually end? And so they come back and they find the Johnson Proclamation of August 20th, 1866. And they find another key little nugget of information that I haven't mentioned. Congress, by mistake, entirely by mistake, the Republicans in Congress, in passing an appropriation bill in late 1866, which had to do with something entirely different entirely. It had to do with payment of people who've improved in rank. Anyway, they happened to mention this proclamation by Johnson as the date at which you're going to use as the end of war. No one realizes it at the time, but the Supreme Court researches the congressional debates, finds it, and says, oh, Congress approved that as the end date too. And so the Supreme Court affirms that. The Supreme Court affirms it. Let me go back to Congress, because Congress then, when they realize their mistake, they say, oh, we take it back. The war's not over. Congress says, in reaction to Johnson, the war's not over until every state that has seceded, we have allowed their senators and representatives back into Congress. That's when the war is over. So they try to rectify their mistake, but it's too late. But they do say that. And so that's why in 1871, 6 years after Appomattox, when the final representatives from the final seceded state are admitted back to Congress, a couple Republicans stand up in Congress and say, finally the war is over. Congress defines the end of the war in a way that is all about Congress, right? And so that's a different ending. So that's why the Supreme Court, how it could get away with affirming that particular end of the war. Other questions?
Oh, I had one. I had like a quote from the book that I thought was interesting, but it was after the official abolition, James A. Hawley, a white chaplain of a black regiment stationed in Vicksburg, Mississippi, recorded a litany of abuses that his regiment had witnessed in the early summer. These included whipping of freed people, cutting off their ears, and even shooting them. And I just thought, I wanted to ask, given that, do you think the fight for civil rights post-emancipation was a continuation of the Civil War, or a separate battle that didn't get enough attention at the time?
It's a great question. Thank you for reading a quote from my book, which of course is always nice. Although I'm actually in that, right? You're quoting someone I'm quoting, so it's someone on the scene. It's not me making this up, right? It's someone on the scene, an abolitionist-leaning chaplain, months after the Appomattox surrender, seeing an incredible amount of violence, I believe in Kentucky, which was the site of extraordinary violence, as were many other states. The fight for civil rights, if we think about that as a fight that, of course, will extend into the 20th century and maybe is still ongoing, I have to say that I would not put that into wartime necessarily, because then you get into questions which is, are we still at war? Were we still at war in 20th century? It is the case that the passage of the Civil Rights Act of April 1866, which is often forgotten about, even though pieces of it remain on the books, that was passed at a time of war. It's easy to forget that. So sometimes yes, on the civil rights legislation, but I don't know how far I want to go there. But what unquestionably is part of the war is the violence being done by insurgent white supremacist groups against black people. Wars don't end neatly. They almost always are followed by some degree of insurgency. I'm using insurgency deliberately because it's a term that we would hear all the time in the early 21st century, especially when we think about the US forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, at a time when people are saying the war is close to over and nearly over, or maybe with one more surge it'll be over. Well, what's going on? Well, there's insurgencies on the ground, insurgency after insurgency. And what's going on with the insurgencies? They're attacking, the insurgents are attacking either US troops or civilians who are loyal to the US cause, which is exactly what's going on in 1865 on the ground in Kentucky and other places. These are former Confederates or Confederate sympathizers who are attacking sometimes US soldiers, but more often black civilians. And I say attacking, as your quote talks about, they're doing all the things that were done under slavery. They're whipping. They're doing some things that are even worse. In Kentucky, cutting off of ears was common. That became a thing in the summer of 1865. If you find black people and you can isolate them. There's a chapter in my book that talks directly about this issue of the violence in Kentucky. And you also find it in Texas and other places. To keep that violence from happening, you need force. You need US troops in place. In Reconstruction, we talk about the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau we think of as a peacetime group of operators whose job it is to help transition black people from a state of slavery to a state of freedom. The Freedmen's Bureau was actually located in the War Department. It is a war effort. These are US officers who are taking on legalistic duties about transitioning people from enslavement to freedom. But they are also US soldiers, and they are in command, or their commanders are in command, of actually armed troops who are going to strike down insurgencies. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 is not only a civil rights act, it is a wartime act. It empowers the Army to act proactively against insurgents. It says that if armed officers in the South hear about a potential conspiracy of white people to attack black people, they need not wait for that attack to happen. They can hunt out the white conspirators, arrest them, imprison them, and disarm them. And this happens. Looking forward a bit to the famous Ku Klux Klan trials of South Carolina, 1870. A lot of talk about the Klan. Oh my God, the Klan they were so successful. That is true. The Klan was ultimately successful, especially after the withdrawal of US troops. But not right away. When Grant is president, Ulysses Grant, under his authority, the Army, acting again proactively, strikes at the Klan before the Klan can strike in South Carolina, brings them to trial, and these South Carolina trials are all the news nationally. Without an army and without a president and a government committed to use force against white insurgency, you don't get progress. That's an ugly truth, that violence sometimes is needed, especially in this situation, to make Reconstruction happen. And that, on the ground, to answer your question, looks a hell of a lot like war to me. And it certainly looked that way to the black people who reported on this violence, to people like the clergyman you mentioned.
One last question over here on the...
Thanks for an excellent talk. Excuse me. I want to go back to the Appomattox sign that you take such exception to, because I'm not clear exactly what the problem is. It seems pretty obvious that the people are proud if they're from that county. I don't know why they wouldn't be, that the peace treaty was signed there. It certainly, I would think, maybe it not, maybe your opinion's different, that it's not the decisive moment, but it strikes me that you could make a decent argument that it is the decisive moment, and all the moments after that are looked at in light of that. So I don't know, I'm not quite sure what, you said at the end you hope they change it, and I was just curious, what it says reunited? Was that the problem?
There's, yeah, because it gives a message that unity was solid and universal. And I'll give an example. Maybe this was just and I don't mean to take you to task on this, right? But you mentioned that a peace treaty was signed there. Most certainly a peace treaty was not signed there. The Confederacy was never recognized as a nation by the United States. Therefore, you could not sign a peace treaty with it because it was an insurrectionary force. As an insurrection, as a rebellion, right, it had to be put down, and the U.S. would have been absolutely within its rights to try these people as insurrectionaries. It did, in fact, try the commandant of Andersonville as for what we would call today war crimes, and it hanged him, Henry Wirtz, and there's a chapter on the book on that. And that happened in November, well after Appomattox, and the trial was a sensational trial. And it was all about how the war continued and how we were still in a time of war because he was tried by a wartime tribunal. He was not tried by a civilian group. He was hanged on the site where now stands the U.S. Supreme Court building. Why else do I have problems with this? 3 weeks after the surrender in Appomattox County, one man sold to another man a bunch of slaves for a couple bushels of corn and some tobacco. That, to me, I've got trouble with. Not the sale. I mean, I guess sales of slaves happen all the time. But the idea that a group of people could take heart that this was the end and that somehow all is well and normal when that kind of thing could happen, yeah, I got problems with that. I've got problems with an image of arms stacked. There is a clear message there that the fighting is over, and yet during Reconstruction, you have incredibly well-armed people. You have race massacres in Memphis in May of 1866, in New Orleans in July. They were called riots as a way to blame black people, but these are massacres. And they were massacres by armed men against civilians, well over a year after Appomattox. If you know these facts, it is a little hard then, at least for me, to stomach the idea that we are supposed to look at a sign like this and say the nation was reunited. The day after Appomattox, on April 10th, absolutely the country in the North celebrates the end of war. And you're absolutely right that in the moment, and still today, it'll be acknowledged as the end. And as I said, I too will take part in this. I too will talk about Appomattox as an endpoint. But I will also talk about the ways it was not an endpoint. We must, as human beings, be able to have two competing thoughts in our heads at once. Because history is not simple and very few things are. On the day after Appomattox in Boston, the city turns out to celebrate Lee's surrender. And all these great speakers give speeches about how peace is here. And then stands up Richard Henry Dana, who is probably the most central figure in my book. Dana was very famous for a travelogue he had done as a young man. But by the time of the Civil War, Dana was better known as a lawyer and one of the best international lawyers in the country. And he's a Bostonian and well known, and he stands up, and all these people are saying what a great thing it is that Lee surrendered and that peace is now here. And Dana stands up and says, "You all celebrate, but yesterday peace was not made. Peace was not made yesterday. All that happened is a general surrendered. Peace must come," said Richard Henry Dana. In the first section of my book, I title it, "Peace Was Not Made," after Dana. Later that summer, Dana would give a much more famous speech in which he said that the enemy must be held in a grasp of war. He uses a different wrestling metaphor. Lincoln says, "Let him up easy." Richard Henry Dana says, "Hold your enemy in a grasp of war until you get from your enemy full security that they will never rebel again." And that security for Dana meant black suffrage, among other things, for black men, and other securities as well. So when I think about Richard Dana, looking at that sign, Appomattox County, where our nation reunited, and I think about Dana saying, "Peace was not made," that's where I come from in reaction to that sign.
We hope you'll adjourn down the hall to the great room for the reception, and please give a thunderous applause to Dr. Vorenberg.
Thank you all.